Thank you very much, Julie. It was a lovely treat to discover these rolls in the collection. And as I commence, it's also important for me to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and speak to you today. So I'm speaking to you today not as a specialist in Ethiopian magic per se. I thought I should run through my disciplinary sins to start. Or in fact a specialist on the Orthodox Christianity, for that matter, of Ethiopia, but as a scholar of images, of theories about images and how they work, and as a scholar of what often gets called magical material culture. So things like amulets, magical handbooks, those kinds of things, from all periods, but especially from late antiquity and the early medieval period. So I'll be having a bit of a natter about the role of images and amulets and talismans more broadly, bouncing off from these two very compelling Ethiopian magic scrolls. I will of course also discuss what can be known of these and Ethiopian traditions more generally. So firstly, turning to the scrolls in Fisher's collection. So these slides are a little dark, but as Julie has explained, there are two scrolls in the collection. The first is a 10 by 220 centimetre scroll which has two columns of text. And the second is a 10 by 133 centimetre scroll with a single column of text. So they're long. Okay, so that's one of the remarkable things about this type of material culture. As you can see on the image, the one with the single line of text is much darker. At least it's much darker at the very top of the scroll, which is where that image is taken from. And this is due to vellum, or the parchment upon which it is written. So parchment, if you haven't come across it before, although I'm sure many of you have, is a writing surface made from the skin of an animal. In this case, the scrolls are thought to have been made from goat skin. They were purchased by the library, the W.H.&E.M. Dean Fund, in 1990. And notes accompanying the scrolls recount that they came to the London auction house from which they were purchased via Beirut. They've been dated between 1820 and 1920. Now that's quite a broad date span, but in relation to other scrolls with more concise provenance in museums and libraries around the world, they certainly look like they were produced in the 19th century. Although there are traditions, and I'll get to this at the end of my talk today, there are traditions of Christian ritual magic of which these can be considered a type and of which these take their heritage to a certain degree, that track back to late antiquity in the Mediterranean and Egyptian region. The scrolls are long and they've been stored rolled, and I'm going to have more to say about that later. On the parchment, written in Ge'ez, which is the liturgical language of Orthodox Christians in Ethiopia, and I'm not a reader of Ge'ez, the point to make about it is that it's not an everyday language. Okay, so it's coming from a particular liturgical context. What the text says or reproduces are prayers. There are extracts from Christian texts. So for example, there are incipits, extracts from the New Testament books, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And there's some rather striking, wonderful images, particularly vibrant images of Archangel Michael with a sword. So we'll see some of those as we go through today. And design elements like knotwork and pattern borders. And you can just see, it's not the most elaborate pattern, but you can just see on the edge here and under here some of that pattern work coming through. Now, in quite a different context, the scholar John Manley, when he's been thinking about the borders on Roman mosaics from late antiquity, and in fact, following on from the work of a rather famous anthropologist, Alfred Gell, he considered such borders, and I quote, traps to ensnare and dissipate evil influences. traps to ensnare evil influences, end quote. So that's an important point, because it reminds us that when we look at these scrolls, that our everyday perception, the way that we look in general at most texts and books, may actually not be appropriate. Patterns that look like decoration to us might, in fact, in the now famous words of Alfred Gell, indeed be demonic flypaper. Okay. So with this suggestion, I'm moving into the realm of the more specific iconographic content. But before doing that, I need to take a few more minutes to make a couple more general notes about the content of Ethiopian magic scrolls in particular and what they were used for. The different names ascribed to these different types of scrolls in many libraries and museum collections around the world tell us something about their intent and use. They can be variously referred to as magic, prayer, or healing scrolls. The Fisher catalogue tells us that these particular scrolls are prayers against evil or illnesses. That they are protective is also indicated by the image of Archangel Michael found on the scrolls. One scroll, the thinner one, has several images of Archangel Michael, one at the top, one around about the middle, and one at the end. Now, Archangel Michael is quite a common figure to find in Christian protective magic, even from those earlier periods of late antiquity. So who created them and how were they used? In regard to Ethiopian healing scrolls in particular, Kristen Windermuller Luna from the Metropolitan Museum in New York tells us that they are made by Dabtaras, who she goes on to describe as, I quote, unordained clerics of the Ethiopian church, end quote. Now, David Appleyard in his research identifies that it's been usual for every church in Ethiopia to have several Dabtaras associated with it, and that this is a role that's very particular to the Ethiopian church, and that they hold several roles. So for him, they hold roles as administrator. He also describes them as scribes and as scholars, and I quote, uses their skills in preparing amulets and in traditional medicine and divination, end quote. I'm going to come back to that amulet word a little bit later today and what that's meant in terms of a class of material culture. But before that, a little more detail on what's known on the production and the use of Ethiopian healing scrolls. Every aspect of their production can be considered important and linked to their use. So, for example, many recount that the animal whose skin is utilised to make the scroll would be involved in a sacrificial ritual, after which its skin would then be prepared as parchment and the scroll would then be formed. Scrolls could be made to match the height of the patient, for what Wundermuller Luna delightfully calls, and I quote, head-to-toe spiritual protection. As she also notes, it appears that scrolls can be especially created for an individual, okay, so commissioned and created for that particular person, but they can also, there's evidence of repurposing. So an individual's name is added to an already existing scroll, okay, a new patient added in. Now the scrolls are understood to draw evil spirits from the afflicted person and to capture them. So from a certain perspective, we can see them or understand them as demon traps. Okay. To do this, they utilise those extracts from Christian books, prayers and images that I've already kind of mentioned. And the scrolls also would be worn around the neck. Okay, so rolled quite tightly, put in a little leather pouch and worn around the neck as a protective amulet or a talisman. Here's a lovely picture of Archangel Michael from the scrolls. Okay, so a few notes or a few words on amulets and talismans and charms. So usually any object that's thought to be very powerful, that was either carried or worn by an individual, could be considered an amulet. Depending upon the culture, this can include objects from the natural world, shells, bones, claws, feathers, all sorts of things, as well as objects that have clearly been worked by humans, carved precious and semi-precious stones, for example, forms of jewellery, objects of metalwork. So in general, the efficacy of an amulet, that is its power, was thought to operate through the physical contact of the amulet with the wearer or its owner. It may be that the object was thought inherently powerful, or that the metaphysical power was placed into the object via some kind of ritual process. To a certain extent, the terms amulet, talisman and charm are kind of interchangeable, although it's more common to see the term charm used when they're discussing objects that involve some kind of text, some type of textual content. Now, such objects are designed to aid or help an individual. This might be by giving or heightening a particular quality, so for example strength, making them stronger, giving them strength, or protecting them from an adversary. Now that might be another human, but it could also be an animal. Okay, so it might protect them from bites and stings, that kind of thing. Or, of course, importantly, from particular types of illness. And we know these from the many, many, many types of carved stone amulets that we get from pharaonic Egypt. Although it's not on our agenda for today, it is worth noting that many amulets could be made from transitory or perishable material. So, for example, strings. There's records of string magic, if you like, with knots tied into the string to bind demons, or involve processes that require the formula to be written on the person's body, and then they lick the formula off. Or a piece of papyrus or parchment or something with the magic formula written on it and placed in liquid, and then they drink the liquid. Okay, so there's all different sorts of rituals that take place around this kind of material culture. In terms of thinking particularly about these Ethiopian scrolls, I think the terminology prayer scroll appeals to me when thinking about them in their amulet form, when they're kind of being worn around the neck, because we can think about them as a perpetual prayer in material form, okay, an continual prayer. Okay, so I think I also should say something about the magic word, scary, not so scary. Over the past 20 years, the scholarship on ancient ritual practice has developed enormously, particularly those commonly classified as magical, which has led to a great re-evaluation of their influence and role. Indeed, there's an increasing tendency to abandon the term magic altogether. It's seen as misleading, associated with ideas of being dodgy or deviant or clandestine or heretical. This re-evaluation of magical material culture has been the result of many factors and not just the popularity of the Harry Potter books. So firstly, there's been an increased recognition and a more holistic understanding of popular religious and social practices beyond a traditional emphasis on textuality in the word and hierarchical church structures. That is, there's been a shift in focus onto everyday religious practice, or what often gets called lived religion. Secondly, there's been major developments in the history of medicine and science, together with the birth of a new discipline, which has been known as the academic study of Western esotericism, which have engendered a new focus on, academic focus on what usually gets called folk or alternate healing practices. And secondly, there's been substantial new finds which have been accompanied by the development of big international publication processes and also large databases. And so, for example, after this talk you can go and look up the Ethiopian Manuscript Imaging Project if you'd like to see a lot more examples of this type of scroll, and actually scrolls from much earlier periods are there as well. Therefore, rather than thinking about magical practices as being viewed as something that's peripheral, and the provenance of seditious individuals or small groups, sects for example, attention has turned to the central role of community leaders, scientists, doctors, priests, scribes, and the identification even of workshops for the production of this ritual material culture. Okay, so we can think about it also as circulating as a particular type of commodity. That's been drawn together with evidence for its contribution to wider society. So thinking about this type of material culture's role in issues of social harmony and inclusion, issues of competition, and especially particular attention paid to healing, concepts of how the body is understood and ancient healing practices. Of special note when we're thinking about Ethiopian scrolls and Coptic magic is the notable role of clerics in producing and administering this sort of material in relationship to that normal and quite general dichotomy between, say, religion and magic, where the two things are seen as quite different and discrete, if you like. Boundaries are porous and lived practice more messy than those neat divides indicate. This is not to say, however, that these practices have been wholly accepted or endorsed by established church authorities. Histories are much more complex, and even with regard to Ethiopian scrolls, various degrees of social and ecclesiastical prohibition and acceptance have been recorded. So my final theme for my little natter today has to do with the presentation of images. There's another glorious picture of Archangel Michael, and what I really like about this image is that he's multi-armed. Okay, so we have two arms up here fighting the demons, and yet there are other arms down here holding kind of another sword. Okay. As I mentioned previously in relationship to thinking about geometric designs, we need to be careful of automatically bringing our contemporary scopic regimes, that is, our everyday ways of viewing things, to look at texts and images produced in quite different cultural contexts. Like much ritual image culture, images in this context have agency. That is, that they're attributed a liveliness or a capacity to do stuff. They are magical. That is, they're imbued with a power whose source is considered to be otherworldly or metaphysical. So they are not illustrations or harmless diagrams. Now, this is a very different way of thinking about images. We might be familiar with images affecting us emotionally, bringing us joy or happiness or rapture or rest, looking at all those cat images online in the middle of the day, or peacefulness or something like that. But it's a less familiar idea that the images can either be, one, ontological, that is, that they can actually be the being. Okay? That is, they're not a picture of a particular spirit being that it looks like, but it actually is that being. Okay? The spirit being taking up residence or is formed by the image. And secondly, that the images are capable of direct action, which affects the person or people directly. So, for example, they can heal an illness, they can make them full of lust with love magic, I'll give an example of that later, or they can do much nastier things, which I won't be talking about. So in regard to the Ethiopian scrolls, Wondermulla Luna particularly describes them as a talismanic art. She recounts their use in healing process in which they are unfurled and priests will recite prayers. However, according to her, the real action, that is the healing action, takes place between the images and the demon causing the illness in the human. The portal for this exchange is the eyes. the eyes of the archangels on the scrolls, which are sometimes schematized to just the figure of the eye or even the figure of the face, and the eyes of the humans through which the demon, which is in this framework understood to have caused the illness, is looking out. So the demon's looking out through the eyes of the human, and they meet the eyes of the archangel in the scroll. The figures on the scroll make the demon flee. And as Wundermuller Luna notes, I quote, "This act of reciprocal viewing is key to the healing act, as invoking the names of God alone will not cause the retreat of the demons," end quote. So these images are considered powerful. The scrolls are not everyday objects, but required to be treated with great care and respect. They are not simply the repository of ideas, not that a book that is simply a repository of ideas isn't a glorious thing anyway, but they are not simply the repository of ideas or different kinds of texts, but they are amuletic. And so, moving on, I'm going to finish my talk today by discussing an example of another type of amuletic book that has been studied by Professor Ian Gardner and myself here at the university. This is an example of a Coptic ritual handbook. Now, Ethiopian Christianity is also often called Coptic, as it was in good part derived historically from the Egyptian church, spreading south down the Red Sea coast, to which it was linked administratively until very recently, and also with which it shares various theological emphasis and themes. But the Ethiopian church, of course, is also its distinct tradition. But with my colleague Ian Gardner, we have examined the Heidelberg collection of amulets and handbooks in Coptic on parchment dating from the 10th century. They were purchased by Carl Schmidt in 1930 and 1933 in Cairo. 3 of the pieces are what we call single quire codices, commonly termed magical handbooks, and which contain lengthy invocations, ritual instructions, lots of different kinds of prescriptions. You must do this, do that, do this, and wonderful, wonderful images. So this is one of the books from the Heidelberg collection, The Praise of Michael the Archangel. And you can imagine Michael's here with some rather funky looking demons at his side. This is another one of the books in the Heidelberg collection. This is Mary and the Book of Angels. Okay. I'm going to be talking to you, I'll leave the picture of Mary up for a minute because it's just so groovy to look at, but I'm actually going to be talking to you about the 3rd book, and we'll come to that in the next slide. Which is known as the erotic spell of Cyprian of Antioch. And it's P. Hyde, invoice Copt 684. Okay. It's a book comprised of 16 pages on paper, dated to the 11th century on paleographic grounds. Now part of the Heidelberg Papyrus collection, it was published by Billabel and Groman in 1934 with Greek and Arabic parallels, and an English translation appeared in 1994 in a very accessible book, if you're interested in this topic, by Marvin Meyer and Richard Smith, called Ancient Christian Magic. In this example, I'm going to focus on the functionality of the magic book and what its material state might be able to offer us in terms of understanding how it was used ritually. The manuscript on paper is in fairly good condition for this kind of thing, excepting 2 pages, page 12, that's page 12, and the final page of the spell, page 13. Okay, and on page 13 we can see here an image, a much degraded image, which I'll get back to in a minute, of Archangel Gabriel. Now, when this book was closed and stored, these 2 pages, page 12 and page 13, would have contacted one another. Okay, so that's a kind of important point for the bit that that's important to note for the point that I'm about to make. The text of ritual instructions, which includes, for example, and I quote, "Fill her heart, her soul, her spirit and her mind with burning desire and hot longing, with perturbation and disturbance, filling her from the toenails of her feet to the hair of her head with desire, longing and lust, end quote. So, piece of love magic. It has that kind of text, and there's also, just above the image, there's a list of ingredients given, which are pretty typical of this type of text to be involved in a ritual. Okay, so these ingredients might be selected for their fragrance or their relaxing qualities. They might otherwise be considered stimulants, perhaps sometimes to promote altered states of consciousness or associated with healing particular physical ailments. Now, just below that list is the image. Now, considering the placement of the ritual instructions in relationship to the image, Ian and I wondered whether the degradation of the image on page 13 was caused by the repetitive rubbing or ritual oiling of the image as part of the ritual invocation, and that perhaps this action was understood to activate Gabriel, if one reads the title above the image as identifying the main figure, which it often did, to activate Gabriel's intercession or bidding to do the magician's intent. The damage to the opposite page, which I mentioned previously, is primarily on the right-hand side. This uneven distribution is curious, but perhaps can best be explained by residual oil matter seeping onto that page when the book was closed and stored. Nonetheless, the wear on page 13 would indicate that the book and its images had an active role to play in ritual invocation. From such a perspective, the book is not something that is simply read, even by select specialists, but itself becomes a locus, an important factor in ritual activity. Degradation of the image evidences that the ritualist, whose fingers were presumably smeared with oils or various other types of ritual substances, must have utilised the image on the, as part of the performance of the ritual. Okay, so they enacted something with it. Now, of course, how that happened is unclear. For example, was the image actually pressed against the ritual subject? One way or another, it seems that there must have been some sort of tactile transference of efficacy from the page, so that the book is no longer just instructions, but is a player, it's an actant in the ritual process itself. So thinking about how the power of the image or the power of Archangel Gabriel was transferred, if you like, from the book itself, from the handbook, to the person or the object of the ritual. So by paying close attention to the materiality of the object itself, so by really looking at the paper and what was on it and its state, for example, another much more expansive kind of materiality, subtle materiality, becomes evident, and it's one that underpins the logic of the efficacy of the intent of magical objects. Okay, so we're talking about the way in which magic itself was assumed to be transferred. Okay. And these types of readings, therefore, complicate approaching images as simply diagrams or as decoration or some type of kind of empty aspect. Rather, it sees images, and in this case the entire ritual handbooks, and this is certainly the case with our Ethiopian healing scrolls, as an agent, as something that has its own liveliness. Perhaps even the spiritual being here, Archangel Gabriel, was understood to be ontologically present in the image. The main point, of course, as with the Ethiopian scrolls, is that the handbook itself is both an actant in the ritual, but also has intrinsically amuletic qualities. These objects were understood to activate and mediate relations between the physical world and indeed the physical bodies of humans and the metaphysical worlds of spirit beings and archangels. Okay. They were a direct, if if you like, breach of that relationship. Thank you.